Okay, so the new seal's back in. I have put a little bit of RTV on those. That might be controversial, but I don't want this leaking again. So we're ready to go in and we'll get that in and get that torque down. Okay, cooler back in and torque set to 12. Don't know if I can do this one-handed. There we go. So all of those set to 12, and that's Newton meters. If you can see that, and we're all good. All right, so new gaskets back on, all loosely tied together with the cable ties. So all of these bolts are loose here on the motor, so that means that this end is pulled together quite a lot more than it needs to be. One thing I did notice with this aluminium coupling, it's really important to try and get these two bits of aluminium lined up. They should line up on the engine. But the reason that that pipe kinks is because these get out of whack. So one gets high, one gets low, or forward and backwards. And so it definitely helps with the cable tie around these two, but you can still get some deviation. You can see that there, just there, some deviation, which means that aluminium pipe is kinked inside the pipe. Now, the other thing I did do is I did put lubrication on those O-rings, both the inside and the outside of the O-ring, and inside those tubes. That was the only way to easily get that in. So with that lubrication, should settle down and take a set once it warms up. Okay, let's lift this in. Right, so back in, just very carefully lifted it in. Just made one little mistake, didn't take that bolt out, which I do need to do, or did need to do to drop it down in. So it's all nicely in, the motor's all really loose now. Just loosen that up. And I'm just put all the bolts in, all 20 bolts are in and screwed down just loose from the manifold. And you can see the manifold's just nicely floating around now. And that cross pipe is just sweet. So we'll get these cable ties off and lower it down and just nip those up and have a look what that looks like. So I've put the pedestal back in. Just show you that. So those 4 bolts are tightened down. They go down to 12 Newton meters, and all of the manifold bolts are in there. They are 16 Newton meters. So next, before the turbo goes in, is to get all this wire harness and fuel pipes back, and then we can move on to getting the turbo on top of that. It is a bit of a crazy design because you can see the mechanism there, all looking pretty good. But once everything's back in, you can't get to any of that. Let's keep going. So progress, just some hints and tips on getting to this stage. So I reinstalled the wire harnesses and the fuel rails. That mostly went to plan with a couple of exceptions. One is this return line's pretty tricky. It has to go down the back of this fuel rail, so I didn't quite get that right first time. This hose has to be finished off, and this one as well, before you can get this front hose in. Tightening up the injectors was a nightmare, so I tightened them all to 20 Newton meters, and then they definitely weren't going to go 60 degrees, so I gave them about another 20 degrees more, and they seem pretty tight. So we're going to call that good and see what happens. Everything electrical I dry assembled, so they're not all clipped down, all the screws are still loose. Got the fuel filter in. Couldn't get to this fuel injector, so you have to leave the harness loose. So the fuel injectors go in before the harness, and the front fuel feed, the main fuel feed, I think that is, from the pump. Got to get that on, and then we're good. So we're just going to reuse these clips. I know they say don't do that, but I'm just going to clip those over. They'll get done up, and then we'll be ready to put this front fuel pipe on, and finally probably put the turbo on before finishing off all those electrical connectors. So let's move on to that stage. Oh, one more thing. I've got to do that water pipe before I do the turbo. I've got to do the main water pipe off the back of the manifold there. Otherwise there'll just be no room to get in there with the EGR there. Okay, let's get to that next bit. All right, it's time to reassemble the EGR. So I've got the 2 bolts, got the pipe. Pipe goes on first before you offer it down. Reusing the O-ring because I don't have a new one. I'm reusing the gasket because I don't have a new one. and if it leaks you would see some smoke puffing out, so it's kind of going to leak smoke out of there. Or if the gasket leaks, you could be seeing water leaking out from here. So that'd be what you'd be looking out for. But just looking at the mechanism, like before, cleaned that up. So I might put some light lubrication on there. So the way it works is this lever goes up and down, and that's what pushes the valve in and out. So you can test that when it's running, and you can open that up, and that lets more exhaust into the inlet. So that's the exhaust pipe on that side, and it lets it out through this valve here into the inlet, and then it goes down through the EGR system. So this cover just clips on, so I'll put that back on, put the valve back in place, and we should all be good. All right, time to get the turbo in. So I've got the new gaskets down there ready to go. One thing I did do with the turbo is take off the actuator, and I've lubricated up the water fitting and also the water fitting hole, and we should be good to go putting it on the pedestal. I did put a bit of sealant on the gasket, on the new gasket on both sides, and if I'm lucky, this will just about drop in. We'll see how we go. Back in a moment. So that went so easily. The way I put it in was, if you imagine you go in like this and put the ear underneath the exhaust and then just roll it round like that and drop it down and drop the water hose into the water hose fitting. Got the bolts ready to drop into the turbo, and the brackets all lined up at the back there. And the real trick for me, and I 100% recommend this to you, is taking off the actuator. We'll see how it is getting it back on, but that allowed me to roll it, whereas before it was just smashing down on that inlet manifold. Okay, let's get the bolts in. So all 4 bolts on the turbo tightened up now. So both the back bracket bolts down there and the front bolts there and there. And we're good to go. So now to get the yokes onto the inlet manifolds, so the exhaust manifolds. So just looking at that, these are the old bolts. So they are steel. Sorry about the flashing from the light there. And maybe I can fix that a bit better. They're steel, so the 3 into the turbo elbow and the 6 into the inlet exhaust manifolds. And then the same, these are the new ones, and they're all copper. And I know they're stretch bolts, and I know there's a special way to tighten them up, but I don't understand what is wrong with the steel bolts. If anybody could enlighten me on the chat, that would be good. Just to share, this is how I make sure I don't drop the bolts when I put them back in. So any of the bolts are in a bit of a tough situation. I've just got this little flex, and these hold onto it pretty tight, so that there's less chance of me having to go under the car or fish it out from down the engine. So not many disasters yet, and we'll get the last ones in. So all 6 of the bolts are now in, the copper bolts in the Y pieces, and I've got the socket on there, down on that one there, and I've done them all up to the 20 Newton meters as recommended, and then the spec calls for another 90 degrees. Now I'm going to give it a go, but I don't know what torque that'll top out at, and it scares the bejesus out of me if I break one of those off. So we'll just give it a try, see what's happening, and probably go with half of the 90. But that's what the book calls for. 20 Newton meters plus 90 degrees, which is quarter of a turn. And I'm just going to use the big breaker bar and see where we get to. Right, I'd say they're all tight now. I took them all up to 20, which seemed to settle them down. What was interesting was they were still slightly different when I torqued them higher. I turned them maybe through the 90 degrees. I would say, if we're talking about from here, probably more like from here to about here. So maybe 60 degrees. And the value I took them up to, I was measuring it with the gauge, was about 40 Newton meters. So in the end, I just set the gauge to 40 and took them all to 40. And I'll do the same. I'm going to leave them for overnight, and then I'll just make sure they're all 40 again tomorrow. Maybe a little bit more than 40. But I'm not going harder. When I did undo them, I needed the full bar to break the steel ones off. And being as those are copper, I'm not fancying they're quite as strong. So we'll just go with that, and we'll keep going and get the elbow on after we've tightened those up.